Hello, you're listening to Me and Paranormal You with your host, Ryan Singer. Because it's more fun to believe. Hey, everybody. Thank you for tuning in and listening to another experience of Me and Paranormal You. I got Jim Harold back on the show. I cannot believe when I'm looking at the dates of the first two times you were on the show. One of them was a really fun live podcast we did at the Arch City Comedy Festival in Columbus in 2016, which just, it shocks me to the core. Jim Harold, the OG Paranormal Podcast, 2005, right?
2005, actually, the end of July, 2005.
The end of July. So we're looking at 19 years of paranormal. But sometimes people are like, you've been doing a paranormal podcast for over 10 years. That's a long time. I'm like, well, don't even start talking to me about a long time. We got Jim, so cool to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it. It's great to be with you. And it's one of those things. Time flies, doesn't it? It's amazing. Really, I look up and it's so funny because I think back to about 19 years ago this month. I was plotting and thinking about how I was going to start this new thing called a podcast. Nobody knew what it was. I was telling my friends, hey, I'm going to start a podcast. And they're kind of like, a what cast? And I said, yeah, I think it's going to be maybe not my show, but I think overall it's going to be like a big thing. I was like, yeah. But now podcasting kind of rules the world, doesn't it?
It really does.
Podcasting's on everybody's lips. You look at all these actors and stuff, and in between their various projects, they're all launching podcasts. But the more the merrier. You've been a long-time paranormal podcaster, so kudos to you. And it just seems like podcasting is growing and growing.
Yeah. And it's, who knows? I think at some point, everyone alive will have their own podcast. And
exactly.
That's how we'll interact with one another.
Well, the joke is, when I first started, it was like, oh, why would you do that? Nobody has a podcast. And now the joke is, oh, you have a podcast. So does everybody.
Yeah.
I guess, to be honest with you, that's kind of why I always I always like get in there. Oh, by the way, I've been doing this since 2005, because I don't want people to think I just, like everybody else, just started yesterday. But, there's some great new podcasts out there. I salute people who say, hey, I've got a mic and I've got something to say. My perspective, good for them.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely don't want to be one of those people that is, well, I'm here now, so no one else should be here. Whether it's, you hear that a lot in like, whether it's immigration talk or just podcasting or getting into any new field, whether it's a physical or a digital field. And yeah, there doesn't need to be any of that nonsense. I like that approach. And if you're listening to this program for maybe the first time, or and you recognize that voice, it's from the Paranormal Podcast. That's the one we're talking about, right? That's the one that's been around the longest.
Yeah, that's the one that's been around. And then Campfire, Jim Harold's Campfire, which is probably actually my most popular podcast, came along in 2009. So those are my main two shows. I have a lot of other podcasts, premium podcasts and stuff, but really what I'm best known for are the Campfire and the Paranormal Podcast.
Yeah, it's a podcast empire, Jim. And yeah, you can go to thejimharold.com. I believe that's the right
JimHarold.com.
JimHarold.com. The Jim Harold is the Instagram handle, I believe.
Yeah.
But yeah, JimHarold.com, and you can get the links to all this stuff. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about today the new volume, right?
Yeah.
Of the book that kind of spawns from Campfire, if I'm not mistaken. So it's called Ghost Stories, right? Or
it's called True Ghost Stories.
Stories.
Jim Harold's Campfire Volume 6. The truth is, it really should be called True Ghost Stories and More, because there's some non-ghost stories in there, but just kind of generally weird. And I always say, and we've done 6 of these now, that the stories of the Campfire are basically the whole continuum of the paranormal: good, bad, happy, sad. So on an average episode, we will have, some scary stories, and people maybe encountered something of a little more sinister energy, but then we'll have some very positive ones. It's funny, just as we're talking today, As we're recording this, I'm not sure what's going to be airing, but on July 18th, I kid you not, we will be releasing episode 666 of Jim
very
Harold's
nice.
Campfire. So that's going to be simply titled episode 666. And I guess you could guess what would be on that particular episode. Some of the scariest demon and devil stories from the annals of the campfire over the last 15 years. But in general, the show is a mixed bag. It's not all scary, spooky, and it's not all sweetness and light, because I think, Ryan, that the paranormal, and I put all the stuff into the paranormal, the cryptids, UFOs, the ghosts, I'm the big tent guy. But some of it's really positive, some of it's in the middle, and some of it's terrifying. And I think that's a more authentic representation of what the paranormal really is, at least from my perspective and what I've heard. So that's why we try to get across on the campfire with people's real stories. They call in, we don't amp them up, we don't juice them up, we don't say, hey, make it scarier. We simply say, tell us what happened.
Yeah, and I'm totally on board with that. 100%. I believe that the full spectrum of what you're describing is the accurate representation of, and I'm a big tent guy too. I mean, you and I are on the same page on a lot of these things. And I think that's, one of the big reasons, not that I don't, give people a chance or don't like people who think differently than me. I don't want to give that impression, but
sure.
I've always resonated with your point of view. Like we line up on a lot of the same things. And I want to talk, if we can, for a moment here about, because I love the name and I love the choice, and it's a very clear choice to use Campfire. And so Campfire's come 15 years now, right? And for me, there is something so powerful and something so primal about the imagery of the campfire and the sharing of stories around the thing that actually provides, it leads, the fire itself as an invention to me is like the number one thing of all time. But, there's something about the campfire, about sitting around the fire and talking, right?
Well, it was so funny. The genesis of the show was not, oh, I'm going to make my most popular show. It was, I don't have a guest this week. So for the paranormal podcast. So I thought, you know what, let's just open it up to listener stories. And, there seemed to be such a positive reaction to it. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. But it seems to me that this is its own show. And then when I thought, well, what do you call it? It's kind of like, if you were sitting around a campfire, and I'm like, call it Jim Harold's Campfire. Because, in subsequent years, there's been a lot of podcasts that have used some variation of campfire. But there can only be one Jim Harold's Campfire, right? So that's why I called it Jim Harold's Campfire. And a little bit of a wink and a nod to people like Rod Serling. Rod Serling would say Rod Serling's Night Gallery, those kind of things. So it was just the idea that we're going to get together and very authentically share stories. I think that horror fiction is a great thing. I think it's a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to seeing that movie Longlegs.
Oh my gosh, I've been
we didn't want to delve into the fictional part. We just wanted regular folks to call in and say something happened to me that's weird. And some of them, they can be extremely elaborate. And some of them can be just really simple. But the one thing I've noticed, Ryan, I've just it's for this book, I've been doing a lot of interviews, and I kind of cooked up this saying, and I kind of like it. Most of the stories on the campfire, both in the podcast and the book, because that's where the stories come from, they end with a question mark, not a period. A lot of them leave you going, okay, what was that about? And I think that's true to life. A lot of times, true campfire stories don't have an easy ending. They don't have an easy explanation. And it's just something that keeps you inquiring and being inquisitive about these topics we all love.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a great foundation of, setting up a space for sharing and for connection and community, because there's something about the campfire itself that goes back to our ancient ancestors sitting around. I mean, this is where the ideas get shared. This is where maybe we let our guard down after a long day, because a campfire typically, my imagery in my mind is at night, and it's the end of a long day. What did we experience? Or and then I feel like people are more willing to share something that might be off kilter or less normal around in that setting, right? And so to create that at the heart of it, I believe is what fosters the success of Campfire. And obviously the sixth volume of the book now. I mean, there's no shortage of people wanting to share their stories and experiences, and there's no shortage of people wanting to hear other people's, to find that connection, right?
Oh, I agree. And the interesting thing is you might think that it's a full menu of people who have a lot of experiences. And I do believe there are people who are more sensitive, they're more tuned in, and they do have more experiences. But just as likely you're to have somebody, I just had someone the other day, this is a story that hasn't even been on the show yet. But the gentleman, I think, is in his 30s now, and he said, "This is my one story. This is the only story I've got. It was just extremely weird to me. I don't know what it was." And to me, the idea that we can be welcoming not only to, for lack of a better phrase, true believers or people really into this stuff like I am, like you are, but also people who may not be as into it, but they just have something weird they're trying to figure out. But my role, really, I've got an easy job with this show, because with Campfire, my goal is just to be a facilitator. I am not there to, I'm dating myself, but not to Mike Wallace people, not to try to quiz them, not to try to prosecute or cross-examine them. It's simply to listen and then maybe ask a thought-provoking question or two, hopefully. And that's basically it. And then I let the audience decide what they're going to do with it. But to be honest, the vast majority of people call in, I think they're being very sincere and very truthful about what happened to them.
Yeah, and you can't. I feel like the light really changed in here. I'm in a weird basement. Feel like you can't do this show for 15 years if you're not genuinely interested in hearing people's stories, right? And because I mean, some people might be asking themselves like, wow, that's a lot, it's a lot of stories and that's a long time. I mean, you probably just hear the same story over and over again. And I'd be interested to hear what you'd say to that kind of question, like, oh, isn't it all just the same story? I mean, because there's people who say, well, there's only 7 types of stories in the whole world, right? But
Yeah.
within that, there's so much room for nuance.
Oh yeah. The thing is that you might get certain kinds of stories that are more common than others, but there are truly unique ones that come up all the time, and it's like, whoa, I didn't see that coming, and I didn't see that coming. And so anytime you start to engage with a caller, you really never know what you're going to hear. Now, there's the sweet dream visitation stories and some of those things that you see crop up quite a bit. But then you'll get something out of the blue. One, interestingly enough, was one of those stories, and it seemed to be headed right down that line. My grandpa died, and then he came to me in a dream, and I'm like, oh, here's the part where he's very reassuring and calm. And he was mean, and he was kind of nasty. Yeah, that was my reaction. Like, oh, I didn't expect that. And it turned out that her grandfather, who she always perceived as being very kind and very nice, she learned more about him. And he was always nice to her, but he wasn't always nice to everybody else behind the scenes. And this is things that she learned after the gentleman's death. And why she had that dream, or if it was her discerning it somehow psychically, I don't know. But it was really interesting. And you can always be thrown for a loop. And that's kind of the fun thing, because it's like you'll be cruising along at this, 60 miles an hour, and then somebody hits the accelerator up to 90 when you didn't expect it. So you've always kind of buckle in and be ready for the left turn. And that's the fun thing about doing it. And I say that also about the Paranormal Podcast, where we interview authors and experts about these subjects, because there's always somebody that brings up something you never thought about before. And you would think it's almost 20 years of doing this, that would not happen. But all the time I'll have an author, somebody's like, oh, I didn't think about it in quite that way. And I think hopefully it does it for the audience, but I know for me, over the years, all of this, the callers and the experts and all put together, it's expanded kind of my worldview and possible explanations for these things.
Yeah, I mean that's really cool, and it's definitely it's a wealth of knowledge through experience that can only be gained that way, and through the conversations that you've been having for all of these years with people who are just calling in, or whether it's the Paranormal Podcast and talking to experts and authors, and it there's this major transformation that I assume, and I'm making an assumption here, so I know it's dangerous, that happens between then and now for you. And potentially it's I don't know, a widening, a deepening, all those kinds of things probably, right? But as far as like knowledge and understanding or inquisitiveness, I'm curious about Jim Harold 2005 starting the Paranormal Podcast, and then now we're in 2024, for goodness sake. And what is something that you believe in now that you never would have thought that you'd get behind originally? Maybe, I know there's a couple things for me, but is there anything that stands out for you that's just like, wow, I'm shocking myself?
There are things that I think are possible that I didn't. I wouldn't say that I'm absolutely putting my pin in them and saying they're 100% confirmed, but in general, because I go back when I was a real little kid, single digits, watching In Search of with Leonard Nimoy when I was in elementary school. And if you remember, if you saw that show back then, and heck, a lot of people listening and watching weren't even alive when that was on, but they would say, we will explore UFOs, we will explore strange creatures, we will explore, everything was very siloed, right? And I kind of came into this with that feeling that everything was very siloed. I have the feeling now that some of it very well may be connected, different phenomena. The other thing is I thought that if you list out those kind of phenomena, they had they were real, even as a kid, I believed. And through my young adult years, I continued to believe that these things were real. They weren't all made up or somebody's imaginings. But I thought, okay, ghosts are dead people, UFOs are aliens, cryptids are strange animals. Now, I still believe all those things, or at least some of those things, exist. Ghosts, UFOs, I'm on board. Cryptids, depends. Land-based, I'm a little more skeptical. Despite my my Bigfoot in the background there, with believe. Also, Cleveland Browns colors. It has two meanings. Believe.
Oh gosh, I'm going to forgive you for this one as a diehard Bengals guy. I'm just gonna.
Hey, I root for the Bengals. I go back to Kenny Anderson and when they had Bengals written across the side of their helmet. So, so I always root for them when the Browns are out of it. But anyway. The point being, I thought everything had a specific explanation. Now, for example, UFOs. We just saw some researchers from Harvard saying, hey, we ought to look into the idea of crypto-terrestrials. Now, that idea goes back, or ultra-terrestrials, and that goes back quite a ways. The idea that maybe the, quote, aliens are not out there, but they're here. Maybe they're underground. Maybe they're interdimensional where we can't see them. Maybe they've been here the whole time. And I remember hearing those kind of theories early on. People like the late Mac Tonnies talked about crypto-terrestrials on it. And I'm like, oh, this seems kind of wacky to me. I don't know about it. But now I'm like, well, maybe they're both. Maybe they're out there and they're here. Or maybe they're just here. My mind has expanded, I believe, in the overall phenomena, but the explanation I'm less certain of. Same with ghosts. I definitely think that sometimes there are ghosts that are past people who interact. Sometimes loved ones who interact. And I think loved ones can interact in different ways by signs, elaborate signs. I've had those before. By dreams. I think all that's real. But also ghosts, residual hauntings. Is it an energy absorption and release of some type? Time slips, people who claim to see ghosts and then the ghost seem as frightened by them as they are by the ghost. The quote ghost. Are we the ghost? Maybe that's another dimension. Who knows? Cryptids, again, I've always said it, first of all, sea creatures, water creatures, I'm very apt to believe that there are animals that have not been discovered, particularly in the deep ocean and things. It's said we know less about the deep ocean than we do deep space. So, of course, there could be cryptids, quote, cryptids down there. Land-based, some a little harder to come by. But again, who am I to go against these people who spent their entire lives in the woods, like hunters, forestry workers, those kind of people? Who am I to say that they're wrong? But maybe maybe the reason Bigfoot's so elusive, and 5 years ago, I don't think I would have seriously entertained this, but is he or her interdimensional? Maybe. So I guess I become more certain that something is going on, even more certain, even though I believe then, less certain of what it represents. When I started these shows 19 years ago, I thought, oh, this will be great, Ryan. This will be great. I will interview all these great people. 6 months, I'll have all this stuff figured out.
You'll have all, yeah, I was going to say, I'll know it all, man. I'll have it all figured out.
Not so much. Not so much. I don't have the answers. I don't know that I ever will have the answers. And that's tough because sometimes people will write me and say, well, I've got a haunting. What do I do? Or I've got this situation. What do I do? And it's like, I'm just a guy that asks questions. I don't know. I've got as many questions as you do, but I appreciate it. But I never want to put myself out there as any kind of guru or keeper of any knowledge.
Yeah, there's definitely a gatekeeping aspect that you can see pop up in the field, and in fact in every field. And for me, that's one of the I guess a pet peeve, I suppose. But right. Let's do a quick little break, and we're going to come back with Jim Harold. We're going to talk more. I want to talk more about. I want to pull this thread a little bit more about thinking that we might get some information or some answers, and then, quite in fact, the opposite can oftentimes occur. And why is that? Is that because of the multitude of questions that appear, or just, the more we learn, the less we know? So we're going to be right back. Just a quick reminder, patreon.com/Ryan Singer, $3 a month. You get no commercials, baby. Wouldn't that be nice? No commercials. Amazon Prime doesn't even do that anymore. So no commercials, no product placement. Well, maybe a little product placement, but we'll be right back. Okay, we are back with Jim Harold, host of the Paranormal podcast, of Jim Harold's Campfire, and more than just a few other podcasts. I mean, Jim, your interests are wide and varied, not only just into the paranormal, but so go to jimharold.com and you can see there's a link that's got a link to all the other podcasts that are happening there. So I want to talk more about this. You were talking about how you thought when you first started 19 years ago that 6 months later you might be like, what, I'll probably know this now. I'll probably have it all figured out. And I'm curious if there's a moment, like a watershed moment for you early on, where or if it's something that you came to later, where you realize, oh, this is only getting more and more complicated, or I'm never going to be able to pin this down.
I think it was just kind of over time and talking to, their guests and then their guests. I mean, I appreciate all the guests I've had on, and some of the guests, they have their theories and they are able to communicate them well. But then there's great guests, people who are at the upper echelon. And unfortunately, many of those people I've had on the show have passed since. Brad Steiger, Rosemary Ellen Guiley, Stanton Friedman, some of the true greats in their area. And when you talk to those people and they say they don't have it figured out, or they say, or somebody like Lloyd Auerbach is another great one. When you talk to people, and then you have people who come across with very compelling theories, who are obviously very intelligent people, it's like, well, wait a minute, I never thought about it that way, kind of like what I was saying before. I think just over time, and it didn't take that long, I can't pinpoint it, but within a few years, I'm like, wow, this is really complicated, and people have been thinking about this for thousands of years. It's kind of egotistical for me to think, oh, I'll talk to some people and do a podcast and have it all figured out. I mean, but I think it was just talking to a lot of smart people and having them even disagree what's behind it. And, you know, I think people, and I think this happens in every field of life, academia, whatever it is, people lock on to their belief system. And you can't sway them from it. And they could be very intelligent people, but they're like, damn it, it is X. And it's like, well, yeah, it might be X sometimes, maybe it's Y other times. So I just realized over time, as smart as the people that I've been talking to, and there are many ones. I mean, I think people who are interested in this topic are given a bad rap. They're considered intellectual lightweights. They're considered woo-woo or whatever it might be. And I think some of the most intelligent people out there are very interested in these topics. And oh, by the way, they have been historically. And to see that there's so many different perspectives, it's like, wait a minute, there's something going on. And I guess that if I had to boil it down to one lesson, I'll give you this one. I had a guest on by the name of Jim Willis multiple times on my show. He just recently passed. Very nice guy. He was in his 70s, former pastor. Want to make sure he's not confused with another gentleman with a similar name, James A. Willis, who is very much alive. He's from Ohio, just like us. But I'm talking about Jim Willis. And he had been a pastor, but he kind of stepped away from that and he became like a spiritual seeker. And he wrote a lot of books about these topics. He was, I believe, in his 70s. And ironically, I just interviewed him in May, posted a podcast of an interview about NDEs with him in June, and he passed away within a few days of that show being introduced, which is sad in and of itself and worth noting. But that's not the reason I bring it up. I went to his Facebook page to see if there had been an obituary or something listed, and he had the most profound quote. And it seems familiar to me. I don't know whose quote was. Maybe it was his. But I think he might have been quoting somebody else. And the quote was, not only, and this is a paraphrase, but not only is the universe stranger than we imagine, it is also stranger than we can imagine.
Oh.
And to me, that's the point. We are seeing through a veil darkly here. We only get a slight glimpse of what's going on. And what we see may be so filtered to make us capable to deal with it with our processing system, with our brain, that we're only seeing a small percentage. There could be dead people all around me right now, and I can't see them like I can't see UV light. By the way, hi, Mom. But anyway, but anyway, God rest her soul. And but I guess my point is that I just think we see such a thin sliver of what reality really is. And I think that's really what's going on here. We're just getting a little tiny glimpse through the keyhole. It's kind of like, I've always put it, and I don't know if I came up with this myself, but I like this analogy. Imagine you're outside an old castle, and that's kind of reality. And you walk into the castle, and you find this locked door. And you look through the keyhole of the locked door, it's one of those old skeleton keys, and you see that it's obviously one of these beautiful, ornate libraries they have in these old houses, right? You don't know which books are on the shelf. You don't know what the books are about. You don't know how many books there are, but you can tell there's a library. That's kind of what I think we are. We are only getting a tiny percentage of what's really going on. That's the thing I think I've learned from what I've done over the last 19 years. Again, I'm flexible enough to say I could be totally wrong about that, but I think that's what's going on.
Get me in that library. I mean, get me in that library.
Well, that's what we're all jiggling
right?
The handle, right?
Yeah, and I love the visual imagery of that. And to me, it speaks to a little bit about, because I've also heard a lot, and I guess I've heard it so many times, I just assume it's true about we know more about deep space than we do the deep ocean. And part of me wonders how that's possible, considering none of us have, I guess we haven't been to the deep ocean, and we haven't been, and it's only our devices that can collect data and information for us that have been to either place. But I mean, that to me is an exciting prospect, that there's still so much that can be known. And the quest for information, I hope I never have it figured out, because I feel like that could be kind of a boring existence. But that, but I'd be interested in your take on this. Why do I feel like I never want to have it all figured out, because life, the universe, and all its mysteries being solved could be boring, but yet I can't stop trying to figure it out. That's a weird. That's it's irony. I don't know.
It's like a paradox. It's a dilemma.
Yeah. So, like, what is the? Why does the drive still exist for us to seek this information, even though we know that we'll never be able to come to terms with understanding it?
Well, I think part of it's, the journey. There was an old Twilight Zone where the guy wanted to, the guy was old and wealthy, and he wanted to go back and do it again. And he said it wasn't having the money and the wealth and all that. The kick was getting it. That was the kick. And maybe the kick is getting the information. And maybe even though we might not be able to swing the door of that library live, fully open, maybe the kick is the fact we can get a little glimpse in, and we can get a little piece of information here and a little piece of information there. And that door opens a crack, and at least we get something. So maybe it's just the journey, just the act of doing it. And humans are, I think, built to try to acquire knowledge and figure anything out. And ironically, some of the people who are the biggest have the biggest critiques of the paranormal community are in science, and they're kind of doing the same thing. They're just doing it in a different way. They're searching for knowledge in their way. So I just think it's part of the human drive. It's like the drive for hunger, the drive for sex, the drive for shelter, anything. It's a human drive that we need to satisfy, that quest for knowledge. And I've always felt, even in doing my job, there's people I worked with over the years who okay, well, I know how to do this one thing on my computer screen, and that's all I'm interested in learning. And I thought, oh my God, what a boring way to live. I always want to learn more. How do I do it better? Can I do it a different way? And that extends to whether we're talking about the paranormal and trying to figure it out, or if I figure out a better way to do something technical with my podcast. I always want to improve. I always want to do better. I always want to learn more. And I think it'd be an awfully boring existence if you didn't have that. So I guess, as you said, if you had all the answers automatically, oh, okay. So having that drive and having that fight, I think that's part of what makes fun to be human. And that's why I've got to say, with all honesty, I would never say that every call and every interview is the most riveting thing I've ever done. It's ebbs and flows. But I can tell you this, there are many times I get a book in the mail or I see a topic, I'm like, ooh, I'm excited for this one. And I'm excited for this story. And I'm excited. And that's still pretty neat to have that almost 20 years on, to have that excitement about, I want to see what they say about this, and really have that. And I hope that comes through on the shows, that I have a genuine love for this topic and a genuine excitement, that it's not just become a job. Because, if it just became a job, it'd be the time to get out and go work at Costco or something.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't think there's no way you'd still be doing it. If you don't strike me as the type of person that is, your end goal isn't, I'm going to see how many chips I can stack, that hasn't been the motive the whole time. I'm going to be as rich as I possibly can. Now, I heard David Lynch say this. I had a 2-week masterclass free pass, so I've been binging as much as I can, right? And David Lynch said something. He's like, listen, I love money as much as everybody else. Okay. But right. He's like, but that's not the number one driving factor in the creation of art. And, we're in consensus reality here. We need money to survive and to do our things.
Sure.
And it's nice. But yeah, it is the surprise of life that I believe makes it more enjoyable. And like what you're talking about, getting the book or a topic comes up and you're like, oh, it kind of tickles the brain. And, I think we need that to I don't know, it fosters, the excitement of life, I think, is important and feeds into hope and feeds into, optimism and just being able to get through.
Yeah,
And
I'll give you an example of one of those. It happened, I think it was last year. I interviewed a gentleman, he's from the UK, by the name of Anthony Peake. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. And he wrote a book called Cheating the Ferryman. And I forget the reason that, Cheating the Ferryman. And I'm not remembering it chapter and verse exactly correctly. But he had talked about an experience that he had, and something similar has happened to me, where he was driving on what they would call a motorway over there. And he had this voice that came to him and said, told him to take some kind of evasive action. I forget what it was. And had he not taken that, he almost certainly would have died. And he started to wonder where that little voice came from. Now, a lot of people would say that's a guardian angel. Maybe that's a past loved one, those kind of things. But he did years of research on this, and he's come to the conclusion that he believes, and I'm not saying this is a right theory, but this is an example of something that really gets you thinking and gets me excited, because it's like, ooh, this is a new way of thinking of life. He believes in reincarnation, but we don't reincarnate, in his view, as somebody else. We reincarnate as ourselves, and we live the same life over again. Oh. And then the way it works, and I'll get the terminology mixed up, so I won't use it, but there's two different versions of us. There's a version, Ryan and Jim sitting here doing the podcast, that would equate to, let's say you're playing a stand-up video game, old school video game, and you're playing Donkey Kong. And you're the donkey. So you're the gorilla. So we're the gorillas. We're the figure on the screen. But the person standing, manipulating the joystick, is our higher self. And that person is the little voice. And that person says, you know what? You ought to partner up with that one, business-wise or romantically. Or you ought to make a left turn instead of a right turn. If you make a right turn, you're going to get into an accident. And the reason you hear that voice is that that person behind the joystick, your higher self, is telling you what to do and giving you guidance. So that little voice that tells you to do things is in fact your higher self. And then, much like reincarnation, I think the idea is to learn lessons and live a more perfect life,
Get a higher score.
Perfect, but yeah. And yeah, almost exactly. It's an interesting concept. I'm not saying I buy into it, but it would explain a lot. And wild. I thought, wow, here at that point, I've been doing the show 18 years, never thought about it that way. And that's what makes it fun. New ways of thinking about it, new ways of looking at it. Another thing that I'm fascinated about is retrocausality. Are you familiar with retrocausality?
A little bit. I'm still real quick. There's something I'm stuck on here.
Okay.
And are we, according to, it was Anthony, right?
Yeah, Anthony Peake. Yeah.
So according to Anthony, is it, we're born into like the same year over and over again in the same life, or am I getting that correct on that?
Yeah, I don't want to misquote him. And again, I read the book over a year ago and interviewed him, but I believe you are born into the same life. Gotcha, I think that's what he's saying.
Gotcha.
I mean, if nothing else, I think it's a good intellectual exercise. It's called Cheating the Ferryman. The revolutionary science of life after death is equal to the best-selling Is There Life After Death? Anthony Peake, and Peake is Peake.
Oh, okay. I was thinking ferry as in Faye at first, but now I get it. Ferryman is, ferry you across the water to the other side. Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Okay, so retrocausality. Hit me with it. I'm not familiar in my memory right now to expound upon it.
Well, this is something that kind of plays into the similar idea. The idea is that, and scientists are starting to come around to the idea, time is not linear, even though all common sense tell us that it is, but it's not. And that could explain so many things. But retrocausality is the notion that something that you do today can impact your past. Now that seems to make no sense, but I'll give you an example where I think it does make sense. We were talking about kind of my journey. I had worked in radio for the better part of 15 years. And while I was working in radio, I did something that I think really annoyed my bosses. See, I was a sales rep. I sold advertising and I wrote copy and I did stuff like that. But primarily my job was to sell ads. They didn't really care if I did anything else, just sell a lot of ads. And I'd gone to school for broadcasting, so I was very interested in broadcasting in general, the whole thing. And the whole time I was working in radio, I always tried to pick up as much knowledge about what every individual in the radio station did. I wanted to know how the production manager did their job, how the traffic manager, the person put together the logs and put the spots. That's what a traffic manager is at a radio station. I wanted to know what the business manager did. I wanted to know what the promotions manager did. I wanted to know everybody's function. Now, really, that was against my self-interest because my interest was to spend as much time as I could to sell as many ads as I could so I could make more money and keep my job. I never realized, why do I have this innate curiosity into all these different job functions? I want to know the minutia. I'm like, how do you do that? How do you do that? I think I annoyed people a little bit. Wouldn't be the first time, but so anyway, fast forward to now.
Oh yeah.
I handle the advertising sales and trafficking for my company. I handle the business manager piece. I'm the promotions guy. I'm the programming guy. I am doing basically all of those functions to some extent in the job. Basically what I do, having a small, mid-tier podcast network, I basically have a small radio station without an antenna and a big staff. I was training myself for a job I didn't know I was going to have. So, did the fact that I have that job now somehow resonate to the past and tell Jim in 1995, hey, you better learn how to do this. You're going to need it. That's the idea of retrocausality. And that's another reason people might say, that's how you meet your mate or whatever. For example, my wife, I met her in college. Had lost touch for 4 years, almost 4 years, 3.5 years. And this was in, you'll have an idea of how old I am now. This was in 94. I had, I was working in my first radio station. I had a very low-level job, making very little money. And I have my old PC that I hadn't used for like 10 months. It was so old it didn't even have a hard drive. It ran off of a floppy disk. And I thought, I'm going to get on that and get on. There was an early bulletin board here in Cleveland called Cleveland Freenet. It was run by one of the local colleges. I'm just going to tool around. It was just text. It was just text. That's how old I am. It was just text. And I did a quick command that showed everybody on the list who was there. And my future wife was on the list. And with this, at this point, there might have been 200 people on the service at the same time. You could message people and say, hey, are you so-and-so I went to school with? She's like, yeah. And we chatted back and forth for about 10 minutes. I said, well, this is stupid. Here's my phone number. Give me a call. And we ended up getting married 2 years later. And we've had 2 kids and have been married for 20, I should know this. This is bad, 28 years. My point is that, and this is a long-winded way to get to this, retrocausality, right? For some reason that night, I felt compelled to get on that computer, that there was some reason I needed to get on that computer. Again, did Jim from 1998 say, hey, get on your computer. It's going to be important. And I did. That's a retrocausality.
Well, it's fascinating to think about. And I was having a conversation just yesterday with a friend of mine about totally different things, but a possibility of a mixture of phenomena, as opposed to, like you were saying earlier, when you're, a silo, like being completely separate from the other thing. I love retrocausality, and you'll often hear stories about trying in the future, making something disappear from a photo that's from the past, which kind of seems like a strange, off-brand flavor of retrocausality to a certain degree, maybe, or something showing up in a photo you took a couple of years ago now because you want to make something appear in a photo. But also, like, is it retrocausality 100%, or could there be a sliding scale to where it's 80% retrocausality and it's 20% psychic intuition now, or from previous you? I don't know what would that be called, as opposed to, what's the opposite of retro? Futuro causality. Like, maybe there was something instinctual, there was something psychic in you knowing the future in 1995, if I'm not mistaken, about learning all of those different jobs, even though you weren't consciously in the front of your mind aware of it, that you were going to need to do all of this later. But then it asks the question, well, didn't that happen because of future you, and time's not linear?
Right. Yeah. And
blah,
then
blah,
you
blah,
go,
blah, blah.
oh, my head. Now it's time for, speaking of old stuff, I've got a headache this big, and it's got Excedrin written all over it. Yeah. And this is the thing. It's a mind bender. I mean, this hour or so that we've been doing, it's gone like this because you can really soak up some time thinking about these things. And it's not something that requires a lot of prompting. It's just, I think once and you probably have the same experience, once you do this long, you think this way. And you become like this closet deep thinker.
Yeah, it's just, there's no end to them. There's no end to the madness, I guess, is one way you could say it. I wonder, have you tried? Now, I don't know where you stand on, I mean, I'm not trying to pin you down on anything necessarily, but maybe I will try to pin you down on this a little bit. Let's assume retrocausality is a thing that we can get behind. No pun intended, I guess. But have you actively tried to, I don't know, experiment with it or activate it? And I don't even know exactly how that would work. But if we can affect the past from the future, what does that mean about our position in the present? Which I'm not even sure I understand what I'm laying out here. But this is definitely the future from our past. Now, can I be like, you need to learn how to fly? So, like, right now, say that to my past self. And if I keep saying that,
yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Does that experiment pay off to where I'm like, oh, how did I not remember that? Or we just wake up one day and we're like, no, I always know how to fly. And then is this memory erased?
Now you get into the whole grandfather paradox almost, right?
Oh,
and the butterfly effect and going back in time. So, for example, and this isn't really funny, but for example, I can give you a very practical example that I could do. My mom passed unexpectedly in 2013 of some heart issues. She had some, but as far as I knew, it was a minor thing that she had around, and she lived out of state, and they kind of kept things from me, right? So maybe as an experiment, I could say to myself, okay, Jim, you have to, before April 15th, 2013, you really have to push your mom to nail her down on a diagnosis of her heart condition. Perhaps you have to get her to the Cleveland Clinic, which, I live in the Cleveland area. Cleveland Clinic is the best heart hospital in the world, basically. And you really have to basically fight with her to do that. And do that. Make sure you do that. So let's say I did do that. To your point, and this is where it gets scary, does it work? That's great. But then does it unloose these other unintended consequences that could be negative? Maybe I end up driving her from the Cleveland Clinic and I'm coming back home and I get killed in a car wreck. So, I mean, it's kind of like the old thing, if you could go back and stop the JFK assassination. On the face of it, of course you would do that. That was a horrible day, one of the worst days in American history. Of course you would go back and stop it. But if you stopped it, what would be the unintended consequence of that? would there have later have been, I think Stephen King even had this in his book 11/22/63, which I highly recommend for history buffs and paranormal buffs, and this idea of different realities. I think, and spoiler, by the way, I think in one of the realities, they went back and stopped it, and there had been a nuclear war. So what do you unleash if you try to do that experiment? It sounds like a really neat experiment. Sounds like a really great idea. When you were saying, like, I'd try to do this with my mom.
Yeah, but I wasn't thinking ahead at all.
But do strangely. I dare do that with my mom, as much as I love her and as much as I'd love to have her back? Because do I know where the rest of the chips would fall?
That's a great point. And a friend of mine who is deeply in tune with, psychic abilities and psychokinetic powers, things like that, would probably, if she was here right now, she would probably say, do not do that. Do not actively try to change something from the past, from your present and or your future in such a way to where you're taking away agency of other things. And because the unintended consequences might, which you would never prepare. It's that, it's like the monkey paw thing,
right?
Where well, there's no way this wish could go bad. And then, here we are. And they always go bad. It is fascinating to think about. But if retrocausality is a thing, it's happening, I guess, without us realizing it. Is that where we're falling on this? Because if we're actively trying to have causation retroactively, right, then we're doing it. Then we're unloosing, right?
But we're probably not doing it intentionally, unless there is, going back to Peake's theory, there's this higher level self, and then it all loops back together.
Are we talking about a unified theory here? Yeah. Well, it's fascinating and it's interesting to think about. I wonder if everyone listening there's got to be a harmless version, like, hey, tomorrow I'm going to be buying True Ghost Story 6. And that'll happen for people.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah, we could pull that one off, right?
That's a good one. Or listen to Jim Harold's podcast. I like those too. I like those too.
So it seems like you've always got some kind of new idea too popping up. I'm curious, do you have a new project that's on the horizon?
Gosh. Oh my God. I have too much. I think sometimes I hurt myself by having too much. Right now we're doing a massive technical shift. I won't get into the specifics on the air, but we're doing a massive technical shift with the way our podcasts are delivered, which is taking up a lot of my headspace. Once that's, and that's the biggest change in 19 years in that regard. And then once that's completed, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we have at least 2 podcasts that kind of fell by the wayside, free podcasts, by the way, that we'll be relaunching. So there's a lot going on. I often wonder if I try to do too much, but I'm driven. I mean, I really enjoy the cool thing about this job. It kind of, you talk about tickling the brain. It tickles all the areas of my brain. First and foremost, the paranormal interest. Also the tech stuff. I'm a techno geek. Also, I love broadcasting. Also, I just like figuring stuff out. And this hits all the marks for me. I really am so grateful to my audience. They kind of made it possible for me to have my dream job. And I'm just really into it. The thing was, we just recently had a family vacation in May for the first time for a week. And it was great to get away, and it was much needed. And I still did a little check-in every day. When you run your own business, you got to do that. But I was anxious to get back. I was excited to get back and tackle the next thing. And that, to me, is kind of the surest signal that you're doing the right thing. When you're actually, I like to see the weekend come. I like to have a couple days where I can try to, take care of stuff around the house, cut my own grass, do all that stuff. But I'm actually excited to get back Monday mornings. What are we going to do this week? What are we going to tackle? And when you're in that scenario, you're doing the right thing. And again, I thank my audience for it because they've been fantastic.
Yeah, well, it's well-deserved, and it's a road well-traveled. by you, my friend. And it's a pleasure to always get a chance to sit down and chat with you. And can't recommend enough checking out the Paranormal Podcast if you haven't, or Jim Harold's Campfire. JimHarold.com is the website. Go there. The Jim Harold on Instagram. It's and the book is available. Where can people find it?
Well, actually, they can get it online at Amazon.com. They can get it at BarnesandNoble.com. If they go to my website at JimHarold.com and click on the green button, actually there, if they're listeners and would want an autographed copy, we're doing a limited amount of those as well. And internationally, if you go to the website, JimHarold.com, and click on that green button, you'll be able to find all the international links too that you can get it online. So it's readily available in Kindle and paperback. And again, Ryan, thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it. I would guide people to Jim Harold's Campfire. That's usually my most accessible podcast, and people love spooky stories. And we hope everybody gets to tune in. And thank you again for being so kind to let me talk with you and have a fun conversation and spend some time with your great audience too.
Yeah, anytime, my man. One last question.
Yes.
Are you doing audio versions of Campfire?
You know, it's funny. I've always wanted to do that, and it would seem to make sense, but I kind of think, well, it came from a podcast, so eventually we'll get around to it. It's just,
it's interesting. Yeah.
You know, it's the spinning of the plates, and it's like right now I can't add another plate, but I've been meaning.
Yeah, it's going to be. Come on, let me throw some more plates on your.
Yeah, but really, to be honest with you, that's something I wanted to do for a long time, and eventually it'll happen.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, Jim, a pleasure as always. Thanks again. And, you know, anytime you've got anything happening, we'd love to have you back on the show and chat about it. You're just the best, buddy. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Stay safe and stay spooky. Bye-bye.